One of the key features to a destroyer was their ability to attain high speed of anywhere from 35 to 40 knots, and one of the means of achieving this was by placing a massive, powerful propulsion plant within the relatively small, light hull. For the Kriegsmarine's destroyers in specific, they used two primary types of boilers: the Wagner high-pressure hot steam boiler with natural water circulation, and the Benson forced flow boiler with the feed water being forced through the boiler tubes. The Wagner boiler operated with a steam pressure at 70 atm with a steam temperature of 450 degrees Celsius, which allowed it to produce roughly 40 tons of steam per hour. The Benson boilers operated at 110 atm with a temperature of 510 degrees Celsius, and they produced roughly 50 tons of steam per hour. I will point out now that early models of the Benson boiler were considered unreliable and they were prone to breakdown, but in the late 1930s this was rectified by adding another drum to act as a steam collector. As for the destroyer's turbines, on the whole they were produced by Deschmag, though Z9 through 16 had their turbines produced by Blohm & Voss. There was nothing too extraordinary or notable about the individual turbines of the German destroyers when compared to their foreign counterparts. However, Z1, 2, 3, and 4 initially were equipped with a cruising turbine, but during test it was found that the coupling loop was too large, and so the cruising turbine was removed from those four destroyers and was never reintroduced to any German destroyer. For the most part, the combined shaft horsepower between the propulsion plants between all of German destroyers tended to sit around 60 to 70,000 shaft horsepower ahead and roughly 15 to 20,000 shaft horsepower astern, depending on what type of destroyer we're looking at. While it will not be important for the remainder of the video, there was another type of propulsion system that was ordered for the Type 1942 experimental destroyer Z-51, as it was supposed to be equipped with 6 MAN diesel engines. The reason it's not going to be important for the remainder of the video is that Z-51 was never completed, and thus never gave the German Navy any problems. All in all, we can see by the general overview that I've just given of German destroyer propulsion systems that they were relatively powerful and most certainly met the criteria of giving the ships high speed. However, there was a serious drawback that was in common between all of the German destroyers, and this was the poor reliability of the propulsion system itself. There are two primary reasons that we can cite that cause German propulsion systems within destroyers to fail regularly. The first one has to do with personnel, whether it be due to a lack of training or a lack of personnel numbers, while the second reason has to do with maintenance. The German boiler rooms were small and cramped, and they were poorly arranged, which meant maintenance was difficult. First, let's take a look at the personnel complications, as this spans back roughly a decade. By 1928, the average German officer spent roughly 26 months under instruction ashore and 28 months at sea aboard an assigned destroyer. By 1938, training had been greatly reduced, as only 13 months ashore were required, with 18 months at sea. The start of war at the end of 1939 shortened this training period even further to 12 months ashore and 17 months at sea. Even though the training times were being significantly shortened, the propulsion systems and general operation of German destroyers was not getting any simpler. In fact, it was becoming more complicated, which made shortening training times more and more of a problem. Problems specifically began to arise with engineer NCOs within the Kriegsmarine, as by 1938, of the 3,876 officers enlisted in the Kriegsmarine, which equated to roughly 6% of the total personnel numbers for the Navy, only 48% of those NCOs would go on for further training. For the NCOs that were selected for further training, they would eventually be promoted and leave significant gaps in ranks, which usually had to be filled by warrant officers, whom in their own respect were often switched between ships every 6 months, which affected roughly 30% of the Kriegsmarine's total personnel. The task NCOs were expected to fulfill within boiler rooms was also restrictive, as was pointed out on the 23rd of September 1937 in Report 5713M, written by Captain Sergei Kamutz. The aim of training is to release boiler room watchkeeping NCOs from supervising any particular machinery or valve. for only then can they accept full responsibility for the room. This aim is coming up against the greatest difficulties because of the physical layout of the boilers and the inaccessibility of the installations. Firstly, the boiler rooms are too small. Particularly restricted is the control stand, from where individual pieces of auxiliary machinery and valves are so inaccessible that the instruments have had to be repositioned on a board because they could not be seen. Second, it is impossible to see the fire in the sucker burners from the central position. The feed water regulators do not work automatically, and the water level has to be controlled almost constantly by hand. The lubrication of the boiler supercharger is poor, and it is necessary to shut down the supercharger at 800 RPM to permit some degree of lubrication to be carried out. Parallel running of superchargers is not possible because there is no common steam valve. If setting up the changeover for operating the supercharger valves takes too long, they run separately and have to be constantly regulated manually. Third, about 20,000 horsepower is housed in each boiler room. The installation is comprehensive and complicated. The vast and rapid changes in pressure require correct handling of these modern boiler systems by highly qualified personnel who understand the interrelatedness of steam pressure, feed water supply, superheater temperatures, and airflow, and have the practical experience enabling them to identify and rectify problems as and when they arise. The prescribed staffing level for each boiler room is 1 NCO and 4 stokers. Because the feed water regulator is so inaccessible, 2 stokers have to be at the central stand at all times. 1 stoker has to be ready to shut off the water level and regulate the supercharger atomizer, while the other waits to close down the burn valve immediately should the sucker burner flame go out, since there is then a risk of explosion. The 1+4 staffing is insufficient to guarantee the safe working of the boilers under all conditions. Later on, the report highlights that it believes each boiler room should be staffed by no less than 1 NCO and 6 stokers. So, at that point in time, the boiler rooms were understaffed by 2 men. However, it also suggests an alternative. The present staffing level of 1+4 per boiler room is too low. The only alternative would be to broaden training, particularly as regards semi-automatic and manual operation, in a calm training atmosphere, for which up to the present little or no opportunity existed. Report B752 was a response to Kamutz's paper, in which it blames a lot of issues on the inexperience of NCOs, the too brief training period generally, and deficient technical instruction of auxiliary machinery operating procedures. The reason personnel could not be increased was that German destroyers had no further accommodation to house more engineers. Furthermore, training could not be increased due to the rapid rearmament of the Navy at that time. Both of these problems would be further hurt by the start of the war, where personnel shortages would become a common stand and training would steadily deteriorate. This was not necessarily a direct cause of the war, but by 1942 it was apparent that the Germans needed to focus on the construction and staffing of U-boats, which meant other areas of the Navy, particularly destroyers, were neglected. This is further exposed by the shocking percentage of the war that German destroyers were available for operations, residing at roughly around 40%. Even with that having been said, I don't want to take away from the fact that during the time German destroyers were available for operations, their performance was rather excellent, assuming they did not run into mechanical complications, and there were even times where the destroyers went beyond the call of duty. Unfortunately, for operating as an entire entity, the destroyers were not an integral part of the Kriegsmarine as was initially envisioned. With that having been said, there is nothing more I wish to add on to this topic for today. So, if you have learned something new in this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.